I mean, citizens started to become more aware of what they need, what their governments were doing, or what they need to ask their governments to do, to even to evaluate or to assess what the governments were doing to ease the effects both of the blockade on one hand, on the COVID on the other. So I assume that these elections will also contribute to that. We saw that the participation rate was very high. If we remember what happened in 1999 when the first municipal election took place, we also saw that the participation rate was very high. If I'm not wrong, was 79.7%. So it was higher than the current one. But it was the first time that the people went to the polls, and it went very low. The following election was 37. So there is an interest from the people to participate. Moreover, having in mind that this Shura Council supposedly will have something to say. I mean, if the constitution is respected and the Shura Council really has the attributions to produce legislation and to control the government, of course, this will contribute to create awareness. And in order to see what they can do, basically with the data we have already from the composition of the elected Shura Council, of course, we have 30 men. The age, I think the younger one is around 40, but the average age is pretty high. But from the background of the gentlemen that they were elected, we have three previous members of the Shura Council, the appointed ones. We had two members that they had experience as member of the municipal council, two diplomats, one that was a previous minister, and four that participated in the writing of the Constitution of 2003. So even though it is not the most experienced or experimented parliament that you can have, being the first experience and having people already, at least 1 1/3 of the elected members that they have experience in some area of policy making and drafting laws or regulations for the country, it is possible to think that they will perform in a proper way. We have to know still how they will act. I mean, how it is organized, the Shura Council, with budget they will have, and in which areas they will be able to perform compared with others. Many things can be said about that, but I will leave it for the Q&A session so we have more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luciano, for your great talk over the election process in general. And I would like to mention some points you have mentioned briefly, because most of the candidates who are winner are actually really experienced bureaucrats or businessmen, which also indicates the political culture aspect of people or citizens, Qataris, in terms of their expectation from Shura Council. But as you said, I believe in this coming 4 years, this can be also changed by the actions of Shura Council, while indicating the role of Shura Council in politics in an active way. They also maybe potentially raise the attention of political participation by wider groups, including the youth or women. So I think we are going to discuss it more in the Q&A session. Now we are moving Mr. ZAID Al-Hamdan. And as I said at the beginning, he is a political advisor and he was working as the Shura Council campaign advisor for the candidates and for the council. So I believe his comments will be really helpful for us to address the campaigning process, the challenges and potential opportunities of the candidates during the election process. So Mr. ZAID, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. Good evening to you, the team on the back end of Sharq Strategic Research, my fellow panelists and viewers of this webinar. I believe the professor made some extremely good points, highlighting the electoral process from a technical standpoint. And I've actually learned many things from his conversation. I think I'm going to be focusing more on my personal experience and what we've learned from this electoral process. My name is ZAID HAMDAN. I chair a group of companies that are visible in 12 different industries around the world. We have an integrated PR agency that specializes in political campaigns. And we've worked with political candidates from around the world, most notably US congressional candidates. And we took that experience and implemented a lot of that knowledge in Qatar. When we heard of the Shura Council campaign date, we found many fundamental differences, but we also found many similarities: campaign financing regulations, voter messaging, communication, and the strategies that are being implemented today to reach out to the younger demographic of voters. Traditionally, in a country like Qatar, the older generations would focus on traditional print media, newspapers, TV ads. But we did notice that this cycle, most of these candidates were willing to spend money on digital marketing, on social media, and even tweak their platforms to appeal to the younger generation of voters. This was very interesting to us, but there is an important point that I would like to highlight as well. I believe that the political landscape in Qatar is very different to anywhere in the world, the political culture as well. Every system of government works for a specific demographic or a specific country, but I do not believe there's a single form or type of government that works everywhere. Qatar is a predominantly tribal society, and has always been an extremely close, inseparable bond between the Qatari people and the government. And there's always been mechanisms in place, be it formal or informal, for citizens to approach figures in authority, figures in the government, and have some sort of involvement in the decision-making process. I believe this historic election of the first democratically elected legislative body in the country stems from the progressive views of His Highness and His Highness the Father Emir as well, in terms of increasing that civic engagement and increasing the involvement of Qatari people in this process. This legislative body has different authorities, and their authorities have expanded now that they have been elected, such as interrogating ministers, dismissing ministers, approving national budgets, except for defense and investments. We're very excited to see what this new council will do for the country. And Professor mentioned some points about the candidates that were elected or chosen. And he mentioned that many of them were former diplomats, former Shura members, and I agree with him. I think this comes back to the culture and society of Qatar. Because Qatar is a small country and a very extremely tightly knit society, it's difficult to take someone with no track record or experience and pitch the Qatari people on promises or on a personal profile of this candidate. I believed from the beginning that it would be much more feasible for someone with name recognition, with good standing in his community, and with relations to be elected. The only way I personally see this changing is if in the next 4 years, we see that this existing council does not deliver on their promises. That's when I think people will start giving chances to younger generations, to people that don't have experience in government. Overall, it's been life-changing to see this process unfold before our eyes. And because of the precedent of these being the first elections and the limited time frame we were given to campaign, so we were only allowed to begin our marketing and our campaigns from September 15, effectively giving us 2 weeks. There was a lot of doubt and concern about the process. But I would like to mention that once we were called in by the authorities with these candidates, the amount of support that we received was extraordinary. And it put the minds of these candidates at ease in terms of providing us with complimentary or free photography, videography, design work, speech writing. This was a good strategy, in my opinion, to level the playing field, because now all the different candidates were able to produce similar content. But the professor also mentioned that he noticed that there were no women elected. And I was not happy to see that, but at the end of the day, these were free elections, and this was the will of the people. I believe this comes back to a social and cultural reasoning. It's all causation of simply the male candidates have had a track record and have had an upper hand in networking within society, and they were able to reach a larger demographic of voters. I hope to see a change in this, and I hope to see in the next Shura Council election more females stepping up and being elected and chosen, because thankfully in Qatar there are so many exemplary female role models. Her Highness Sheikha Moza, Her Excellency Sheikh Al-Mayasa, Her Excellency Sheikh Hind. But besides the royal family, we've seen Sheikh Ambassador Sheikh Ali Al Thani and Her Excellency Lulwa Al Khatir, the Deputy Foreign Minister. They have done amazing work, and no two people in Qatar will disagree on the quality of their speeches and the quality of their work. I hope that these females continue to serve as role models for young Qatari girls around the country, and I hope to see more females elected in the coming Shura Council cycles as well.
Thank you, Mr. ZAID, for your insights, which is from the field in terms of candidates' perspective and locals' perspective. I think we have learned a lot, and I have some questions to you ask at the end. Now we are gonna move to Mark, and he will be talking on the digital aspect of the elections in terms of the candidates campaigning on the social media, and in terms of the cyber problems that Qatar was having since last 4 years. And in the election process, there was also a problem regarding the hashtag of Shura Council. So we would like to hear more from Mark regarding his research or insight regarding the digital aspect of the elections. And it is your turn, Mark, please.
Thank you, Betul. Thank you for having me, and it's obviously great to share a panel with colleagues and esteemed speakers. Yeah, so I'll be talking a little bit about the cyber element to this. Now, obviously, you know, Qatar has embarked upon this democratic journey in an age where social media is considered fundamental to campaigning, and this is true the world over. And another truth that we've seen, particularly in the past 10 years or so, in the advent of the post-truth age, is the use of social media for nefarious purposes, right? So as with any campaigning platform, usually there are rules and regulations in place that kind of control, limit, or influence how candidates are able to use advertising to promote themselves. Now, one of the complexities with social media is obviously that many of the companies whose platforms are very popular, such as Twitter or Facebook, are based outside of the region. And this means that the functionalities of those platforms are often beyond the control of particular countries. And so really there is, you know, many countries are actually at the mercy of the functionalities of these platforms. And unless they enact sort of draconian sort of censorship laws, then they don't have a great deal of control over them, which makes it a very interesting space. And that's just the context of the space. And I was very curious too, obviously we're in a region now where there has, and globally, this issue of democratic backsliding. The idea that countries that are democracies are seeing an encroachment on those structures of democracy, a sort of regression, if you will. And obviously it's interesting now because Qatar is actually embarking on a democratic project in the midst of all this. We've seen, for example, in Bahrain since 2011 become less democratic. We've seen what's happening in Tunisia now, another example of kind of reversion to authoritarian rule. And what's very interesting about this climate is that there are obviously countries in the region that are particularly sensitive to issues of democratization. And in the Qatar case, you know, there's generally this kind of, there's the belief of the domino effect that if one country democratizes, that will increase demands for democracy in other countries. And in the case of, for example, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, they're very cautious and they're very aware that there might be such claims. So to see Qatar democratize in this regard has prompted campaigns from other countries. We don't know who's behind those, and we don't know what actors are behind them. But certainly what I noticed on Twitter on certain hashtags prior to campaigning, for example, on the Qatar elections hashtag, we saw those hashtags being manipulated. And we saw that the very real concerns that some Qataris had about the inclusion were also being manipulated. So in other words, the kind of the sort of teething troubles that we were seeing in the democratic process were being exploited, and those fans were being flamed by external actors. Now, that's not to say that the concerns weren't valid. It just goes to show that in a sort of globalized world with digital media, that countries don't have sovereignty or autonomy or complete control over their digital information space, which means that any issues that might arise, whether they're social or political, can and will be and have been manipulated to the extent that others outside the sovereign space of Qatar can actually pick on particular issues and blow them up. So we saw lots of bots and other influence from outside the region trying to kind of, certainly use the Qatar elections as an opportunity to attack Qatar, which we've seen again a lot since 2017, since the Gulf crisis. So that's something that I think is a really particularly interesting thing about the region, because there has been a tendency to focus on electoral manipulation in the United States coming from Russia. But I think it's very important that people realize that this happens the world over. And at the moment, Qatar is no exception. So that's one thing I want to note about the transnational scene. I think on a local level, it's very interesting. And I think as ZAID touched on, people are being encouraged to and are using digital media to campaign. And we saw this over the past week, people using hashtags to kind of promote their candidacy, lots of image-based, essentially what looked like posters that you see by the side of the road being used on Twitter, and people using that to campaign. I think what we don't know yet, and what we should and would be interesting to find out, is actually the effectiveness of these online campaigns. Because I think any political structure, any change tends to reflect the existing political structures that are extant in society. So if you have, for example, a situation where, for example, the majalis and majlises are influential in allowing people to talk about politics and also as a space for campaigning, how do we know, for example, that those spaces are actually probably just more effective than what we see on the digital sphere? So I think this is an increasingly important question. How much does the digital sphere actually matter when it comes to the public-facing platforms like Twitter and Facebook? Having said that, there's a lot to be said for the closed digital spaces that we don't monitor. So things like WhatsApp, Signal. I mean, obviously, lots of people in Qatar have big WhatsApp groups or family WhatsApp groups or friends groups, and things transmit incredibly quickly across these platforms. However, they are not subject to public scrutiny and they're not public messages. Right? So I think what we'll probably find out in the case of any country, and particularly in Qatar, is that the more effective ways of campaigning communication will be through private digital messaging apps rather than public-facing ones. But I think public-facing ones are still important. But I don't know whether this election has really demonstrated that they have shown a demonstrable impact, because, as has been mentioned, most of those elected are sort of established figures within society, people who use social media, but usually social media use is associated with youth and younger people. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. And I think going forward, it'll be the basis of studies within Qatar.
Thank you, Mark, for your insights. And I think this aspect of the private digital, the applications that Qataris were using, but in a private sphere for their family and friends, I agree with you. I think this will be a nice chance to learn more about people's private conversations about the candidates and the elections, which maybe they will be more even clear in terms of their opinion or the perceptions of the elections. I have 2 questions sent through Twitter to my direct message. And the first one is for Mr. ZAID, and it says there was a quote in Doha News about the candidacy challenges for women, because everyone was talking about why women were not elected, although they were actively participating in the process. And the quote says, because majalis is actively used for the election process, but it is usually used by men. This prevented women's success in the election. And the question is asking for if this is a real reason for the failure of women in the candidacy process, or do you see any other thing that are demotivating for women's success in the election? So Mr. ZAID, they wanted to talk more about the failure reasons, the reasons why women failed in the elections. Would you like to answer this?
I'd like to thank her for her question, first of all. I believe there are some variables that are directly tied to male involvement in majlises and gatherings, the social aspects and how men in Qatar mingle more with other men. And it could be direct causation for why it would be easier for them to reach a larger demographic of voters. But I would like to keep a few points in mind. In today's day and age, there are many variables at play here, such as the COVID pandemic. And Qatar has been extremely efficient at handling the pandemic with the vaccination rate and with limits on gatherings. So the majlises and the large gatherings were not utilized as much as they would and be, in my opinion, because of this pandemic. But I think another main reason goes back to a point that I mentioned earlier, which is name recognition. It's not just about mingling with these men in the majlises and speaking to them. It's about seeing so many of these candidates that won seats in the new council. They have an established name in Qatar for being a diplomat, for being a government official, for being a businessman. And name recognition was very important in this society because these districts are very small. And because of Qatari culture, because of culture in the region in general, these women started with less name recognition in most of these instances. That would be my personal opinion on one of the reasons why we didn't see females elected. I believe there are many different ways to offer potential solutions to this going forward. And I believe in the next cycle, hopefully there will be nothing called a pandemic anymore. We're going to see more government regulations and more platforms or gatherings that are hosted by election committees to ensure more of a fair platform for these candidates. Because at the end of the day, I believe the only way to ensure a fair slate and equal representation would be for the electoral committee to host most of these events and these panels and these gatherings to ensure that potential voters in these districts look up all of the candidates.
Thank you. I have to add on this. I have a question for you and for Mark, but Luciano can also answer if he has a point in that. Because we were talking about the candidacy process and the campaigning process, and now that they had only 15 days, as you said, to campaign, but now they will have 4 years to build a new name in the Qatari politics. So do you think there will be more people actively building their names in social media, in political platforms, or in majlises, or for women, any other platform, to be ready for the other elections? And do you think they will be also receiving more professional help, because your company was one of the few ones which were helping, and also you as like a personal political advisor, you helped them to proceed the election in a professional way? Do you think there will be more professional help to the candidates? Because what I saw in their social media accounts, I'm sure Mark has more knowledge on that, the followers of most of the candidates were really had few followers. So especially the ones, let's say, above 45, 50 years old, I have seen maybe only 100 followers for some of them on Instagram or Twitter. So considering the impact of Twitter or the social media in general, do you think they will be using actively more the tools like social media and like professional help, or they will be building their names in a more professional way? I would like to hear more about that, if it is possible.
So thankfully, as I mentioned earlier, we had experience running campaigns in different countries, and that's why we were in a position to be a viable support system for these potential candidates this cycle. But I believe for the next cycle, most of these viable candidates and potential candidates will begin campaigning without actually campaigning much before the electoral cycle. And that could be through philanthropy, through name recognition. As I mentioned many times, Qatar is a very small, tightly knit society, and potential candidates will be working much harder to build their name, build their reputation, build their track record, and find different means of reaching voters To answer the second part of your question, which was about having more companies and people involved, I believe whenever there is something new, be it an industry, an organization, or a cause, and there's money to be spent, then the private sector will follow and will go and offer their services there. So I do expect to see the next election cycle, we're going to see many companies stepping up, many individuals offering political advice, offering different solutions for these candidates. In addition to that, simply because this was a historic first and there was no precedent, many of these candidates were timid in their competition and in the programs they wrote for their political candidacy, in the ways they marketed themselves. People were still finding their feet. And this stems to many different reasons, including the Qatari culture, and also including that this was a first and people were still finding their feet. So I believe the next cycle, we're going to see crafty competitors. We're going to see more fierce competition. I don't believe we're going to see direct attacks on each other, simply because, as I mentioned, the society is very bonded and tightly knit. So, and Qatari culture and Arab culture doesn't really have room for personal attacks, but we will see these viable candidates have more confidence in the ways they compete. And we're going to see crafty ideas in the next cycle.
Okay, thank you. Mark, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree with what's being said. I think, you know, the problem of external influence will never go away. And I think if there is anything nefarious, like attempts to undermine candidates, attempts to exploit the elections, they will be done in a way that's not attributable. You know, it won't be clear who necessarily is behind those. I think one of the interesting things, and it draws on what Luciano said about continued participation in elections. I mean, Luciano mentioned that the decline in the turnout for the municipal elections. I think this is something that needs or will be interesting to view, because despite campaigning, I think there is an element of if someone is elected, to what extent will it be seen as problematic to actually challenge that person's candidacy, unless there is some obvious scandal or there's some serious local competition. So my concern is that there will be an element of a potential stagnation in turnout that is driven by a sense that there isn't a sense that things can or ought to be changed, because that might be seen as you know, discourteous to some extent. And I think as well, the inclusion of or the lack of inclusion of women, or lack of election of women in this case, is something that will drive that. I think it would be very easy for that to create a sense of despondency that, oh, this is not possible. But at the same time, I think, you know, the tools are there for a potential insurgent candidate to actually do a strong campaign, especially if they sort of start building up the reputation now using social media. But at the same time, I do wonder that a despondency might set in, and that the status quo might just stay as it is.
Thank you. I have a question on Twitter to Luciano, but any other speakers can also add on this. The question is about the NGOs and their potential role in coming 4 years.
Sorry, again,
for NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And she is asking, because there was a lot of critics over the women participation and the success in the election process, do you think NGOs will be more helpful to guide the message that political participation also includes women in the coming 4 years? So do you think there will be more collective, to at least reach a collective level of understanding in terms of women participation and representation? Do you think there will be more organizations to guide the society or to raise the awareness? Because candidates were quite upset, women candidates, because they were working hard, of course, to reach a level of success. What do you think, Luciano?
Okay. Well, first of all, having in mind what our colleague ZAID mentioned, I think, so far we don't know how women perform in the elections. This is the truth. We don't know how many votes they got. We don't know if they lost by a huge amount of votes or they just lost for a few votes, because we don't have data. And this is the main thing. In order to improve, in order to have a campaign, in order to improve in their performances at the electoral level and doing campaign and doing kind of social action that can contribute to enhance the women participation or empower participation of women through elections, we need to know what happened. So far, we know the winners. We don't know how many votes the winner obtained, and we don't know how many votes women got. So if we don't know how they perform, how we can know what needs to be done in order to improve their chances in the future. This is on one side. On the other side is considering how the tribal customs work in the Arabian Peninsula. It's very difficult that if you decided to go through tribal representation, the vote will not be directed to the most important or most influential people within the tribe, because what voters try to do is that their vote is counted as a valid one that will have impact on the policy making. If you want to exert some influence in the policy making, you need to vote for the people who can exert some kind of influence over the political process. So in order to do that, you will vote for the people that is more influential within the society and that they can perform better in the parliament. If the society is voting all in terms of tribes, they will vote for the most powerful people within the tribe. Unfortunately, the tribal society is not favoring women participation. So if this is the path, I would say that women will have a very hard road ahead to get more participation in the future. And we have examples. I mean, Kuwait was an example. The women started to have the right to participate in the election in 2005. They made it to the parliament several times, and in the last election in 2018, they failed to achieve any woman in the parliament. Again, because of the way in which voters are performing. It doesn't mean that, I mean, half of the, or more than half of the registered voters in Kuwait are women. They are not voting for women. I don't think it's lack of capacity of those women that they are very active in politics and they are very active in the civil society, in the Kuwaiti civil society. It's not because of they are not performing properly in the civil society that they don't get votes. It's because even women tend to vote following the patterns of voting that are favoring men, that they are more influential in politics or they can exert more influence over the government. So I don't know. I mean, maybe women can perform better. They can participate much more. But what do they need to do to convince other male voters that they can perform as good as men in an elected institution in this context, which is mainly tribally organized? So it's a little bit tricky to reply this question. But of course, we have four years to bear in mind that, or to evaluate how they can do. I mean, we know that women are performing also in the municipal council. We have two members, only two members since 1999. Fatima Al-Kuwari and Sheikh Al-Dubai. They are the only two that managed to enter the municipal council. And we have almost more than 15 years of election. I mean, 5 elections in the municipal council, or 6, if I'm not wrong. And the chances they did not improve that much. So what else they need to do?
Thank you, Luciano. I think this is also why people were expecting to Emir Sheikh Tamim to assign a woman for the 15 part of the Shura Council later. I saw news on Doha News, and Amal Al-Maliki, she was suggesting, who is the dean in HBQU, and she was suggesting gender codes for the coming elections. Do you think this is possible to make in Qatar? Or do you think this will be something to help society to understand the wider participation?
To me again?
Yes,
Or
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To whom? Sorry.
I am asking clear.
Okay. I mean, of course, there is always this debate whether quota is counterproductive or beneficial. I mean, some countries, they improve the quota. In Iraq, we have a system that has quota. We have quota in Spain, in Argentina. But for instance, in Argentina, even though there is a quota, women in parliament are much higher than the quota. So the quota actually contributed at some point to create awareness, but now it's not important anymore because people are voting more women than men in many elected positions. Even we had a women president elected 2 times in Argentina. So of course it's a long-term process, but there should be one direction pushing for that to happen. Our colleague ZAID mentioned many very renowned women that they are doing a great job here in Qatar, but it seems that it's not enough. And unfortunately, even though the women are performing very well in the business sector and other areas, as you mentioned, HAmDAN Maliki, we had the president of Qatar University, we had the dean and College of Arts and Science in the QU. We had many women that they are performing very well in other positions. Why not? I mean, even in foreign policy, the speaker of the foreign ministry, is a woman, she's doing a great job. Why not in non-appointed institutions? So there's something else that is, I mean, it's not only in Qatar, I mean, in most of the GCC states, female empowerment through elections has not been as successful as the governments expect.
I don't think some people treat it as a radical construct, right? But the whole, I mean, you know, if you look at how the electoral system's been devised here, it's been devised in a way that it's not arbitrary. It's, you know, the electoral districts are generally, it's done to kind of give voice to the different tribes in Qatar. So it's constructed around a tribal template, right? So to introduce quotas for women isn't actually against the logic of the system that's been deployed. It's just not been done in a tribal way. So it's perfectly possible, and I think it's not controversial in the sense that that's the system that's been created. It's been created to give voice to specific groups of people. It just hasn't been created to give specific voice to women, which I think is probably a very useful thing to do. And it doesn't have to stay that way, as Luciano said. You know, in Spain, women are being elected. So I think it could be seen as a stopgap until there is better representation.
I have a few points to add, if you don't mind, just to points made by my esteemed colleagues. So, Professor Luciano, you mentioned that the difficulties surrounding women candidacy. Now, I'm not oblivious to the fact that it is harder for a female to gain representation simply based on many variables that we discussed throughout this session. But I don't want this conversation to deter young Qatari females from running. As I mentioned, Qatar is doing very well in terms of attempting to have equal voicing and equal representation. From the first elections, women were given the right to vote. I can attest to dozens of parliaments around the world where it took many cycles for the constitution to recognize that a female can vote equally. Now, I have seen, as I mentioned, many inspirational females in Qatari society, in government and business. And I just want to reiterate the fact that just because there were no females elected now, that does not necessarily mean that this will not happen the next cycle. Yes, maybe females need to start earlier. Maybe they have to find different avenues to build that name recognition that's maybe easier for male candidates, but it's completely possible. In terms of introducing a gender quota, I don't have a specific opinion regarding that because, as my colleague mentioned, it could be productive, it could be counterproductive. This was a free and fair election. This was the will of the people. There's an argument to be made that should these females convince these people and should we let these things play out naturally? Or do we have to introduce this quota to ensure equal representation or representation for females in the Shura Council? It's important to have females, and I do believe that the next cycle will be different. I'd also like to touch on one more point that Luciano made earlier, which was about data. And from day one, I've been advocating this specific point, the availability on voter data, not just for post-election analysis or conducting studies, which is extremely important, but even when we are campaigning and creating a message. I told every candidate I would have loved to see more numbers about the age groups in the specific district, the ratio of men to women, and that helps in terms of constructing the message, building your platforms. And I do truly hope to see more available data going forward, be it from the government or from the semi-government or even the private sectors. And I predict that this will be an industry, gathering data on the age groups, the genders, the demographics of voters in a specific district.
Thank you. I think this is a really important point, not only for researchers, as you said, but also for the candidates, for the advisors like you. And this will be definitely more helpful to proceed like more successful campaigning process. I have last question for all of our guests, and if they would like to answer, I would like to talk about the content of the Shura Council's discussions, because according to the Constitution and the electorate law, mainly in the Constitution, the role of Shura Council or the power of Shura Council is limited to the issues that are not key top security issues for Qatari state. So, which may include anything about foreign policy, economics, or international treaties or peace treaties that which are regarded like top security issues by the ruling elites or the emir himself. So my first question for Mr. ZAID, do you think this limitation of content for Shura Council's power, members' power, is effective their candidacy campaigning process? While they are talking about the solutions or proposing some changes in the politics of Qatar, do they have this limitation for their candidacy campaign? Or do they use any kind of argument regarding the Qatar's international role or providing more international, narrative in their campaigning process? Or they were mostly limited to local needs, which is kind of conveying the needs of society to Shura Council or the rulers? How do you see it?
So first of all, I'd like to mention again that the system of government in Qatar is different to many systems around the world for many different reasons, being a predominantly tribal society, and also the bond that currently exists and has always existed between the people and the government. So when a certain tribe or citizens have a certain concern or want to voice a specific idea, it has always been easy to approach figures in government, figures in the royal family, and voice those suggestions, those concerns, that feedback. When we talk about the power of this elected body, they do have certain powers, as I've read in the laws that were circulated, as I mentioned, including interrogating ministers, dismissing sitting ministers. But when we talk about an issue as sensitive as defense or security, His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad is the commander-in-chief, similar to the US system, where I believe that you cannot have such a sensitive issue like defense up for a council that may or may not be experienced in that specific field. But the Shura Council, and the term Shura is deeply embedded and stems from religion and from culture. It's advisory. It includes consent. And I hope to see that this Shura Council will work hand in hand with the executive branch, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with the Ministry of Economy, etc. But I think that the balance of power that currently exists is very beneficial and was well thought out.
Thank you. I think these are really important points for us to keep in mind. So for Luciano and Mark, regarding the same content, the power of Shura Council is, as we mentioned, limited to some topics, but they may overlap. An economic issue may be also related to an international treaty or a local problem or an international threat may, lead a local problem. So do you think there will be more content-based or content-oriented discussions when it comes to Shura Council? Because so far we are talking about the turnout, the role of women, or in general the candidacy process. But do you think there will be more discussion of the issues that Qatar is facing locally or internationally by Shura Council members? Any of you may start.
Luciano.
Do you want to speak, Mark, or you?
No, please, you go.
Okay. As we were all saying, this is the first experience, so we need to see. First of all, I think that I will make a comparison with our sons, Betul. The children are always trying to test you the limits. They need to know where they can go, to what extent they can say no to all the things you say, or yes, or they want to do whatever they want. So I assume that these 4 years will be like an experiment like that. That's according to the constitution, they can do some stuff. They can interrogate ministers, but to what extent the elected Shura Council will, let's say, dare to call a minister to criticize or to interrogate the minister? Of course, according to the interpretation of the constitution, they can also dismiss or to impeach a minister. I'm not quite sure this is exactly the case in Qatar. Maybe ZAID can clarify that. But they might be not interested in doing that, because there is a general consensus about the good performance of the government. Moreover, after many challenges that Qatar suffered, the blockade, for instance, in which there was a strong support from the whole Qatari society towards the government, claiming that the government is not doing something properly, for instance, in foreign policy, it would be a little bit complicated. We know that there have been some discussions, even in the appointed Shura Council, regarding the pensions law or the labor's law, or even the citizenship law. So there will be some topics that will be discussed, that they will create debates among the society and among the Shura Council, and that they can, of course, I wouldn't say criticize, but that they would discuss things that they were proposed by the government. So maybe the Shura Council will go not in the same exactly direction of the government. So this is part of the political process, part of the political culture, that not everybody have the same ideas or the same program. And sometimes the government may go in a different direction than the Shura Council. This is normal. This is expected, actually, in every democratic society, that not everybody is going into the same direction. But to what extent something that was proposed by the government or even approved by the government will be changed by the elected Shura Council, it's something that we need to know. We need to wait and see how they perform, what are the profiles of this, the 45 members, or we still don't know which are the 15 appointed by the government, how they will perform. And actually, we don't see many issues in the candidates' programs that they were dealing with. Big issues like security or foreign policy. So many are things that relate to better health care system. Some people were talking about the citizenship law or educational issues, etc., etc. So we need to wait and see when and in which aspects the Shura Council will start to perform properly as a legislators, and when they will start performing as controlling the government.
Mark, if you allow me, I'd just like to address a few points made by Luciano before giving you the floor.
Yeah, no problem.
So I can confirm from what we've read that this council will have the authority to dismiss sitting ministers. You will have to have a certain number of members, and I believe that number is 30 to dismiss a sitting minister. I don't predict that there will be many clashes between the executive branch and the Shura Council, because there is somewhat of an understanding. There's a general consensus of the policies set out by the government. At the same time, I would like to mention another point. In Arabic, we say al-kamal lillah, which means only God is perfect. And electoral systems, powers given to legislative bodies around the world have changed and evolved over the years hundreds of times, even in some of the most sophisticated countries and the oldest countries around the world. The US congressional system has changed dozens of times in terms of the powers of Congress, the number of members, etc. So as Luciano mentioned, this is a test, the first elected body in Qatari history. Will there be changes to the authority, to the number, to the way districts are divided? That is a possibility, and we could see this evolve going forward in future cycles.
Thanks. I'll just add my 2 cents worth, 2 cents. But yes, I think there's 2 ways you can go down this road. The question is here. I mean, firstly, Qatar, there's a lot of goodwill now because this is the beginning, or seen as the beginning of a transition to a democratic society. And it's important because there's no huge pressure to for example, suggest that there needs to be the Ministry of the Foreign Ministry or Ministry of Interior need to be under direct scrutiny of the Parliament. There's an assumption, I think, amongst most people that when you have this type of democratic transition, there's a teleology that it reaches a point, that it will reach a point in which you see more and more groups of people within society empowered, and overall people will gain more power. That's, I think, an assumption. We don't know what is going to happen in 4 or 8 or 12 years. But I think there's certain elements that are important, and that would certainly be trying to see more representation from different groups within Qatar. I think that's the priority. And I think once those things are addressed, the expectations of the powers and the limitations of that elected body are then should be then subject to scrutiny, if that's indeed the goal. But I think at this point, to sort of assume that there should be this immediate switch to a system that resembles I don't know, say, the United Kingdom is unrealistic. Whether or not that's desirable is not actually a question for me to answer. I think there are a lot of people who expect and want a system that runs like that. But I think the important and the priority should be placed on making sure that the democracy that exists is as inclusive as possible and as representative as possible. And I think once that happens, then the elected members will better reflect society as a whole, and they'll be in a better position to determine what they think Qatar wants. Because I think at the end of the day, that is a decision that needs to be made by the Qatari people. And in order to make that decision reflect the Qatari people, the decision needs to be made by as representative a body as possible.
Thank you, Mark, and all of our respected guests. I totally agree. And the fact that ZAID mentioned in many countries in the world, not only in the ones in the Middle East, we have the same problem in terms of women representation. So while discussing this in Qatar, we don't ignore the fact that this is a global issue. So we need to give a chance to societies to experience this 4 years, even more, to understand or to create their own way of representation and participation. So I totally agree with the fact that the local and unique characteristics needs to be considered while talking the political culture or the election results. I have done with my all questions, and thank you all for your participation and for your comments. I think we had a really fruitful discussion about the elections. If you don't have anything to add, this is all from our side as Sharq Strategic Research, and we would like to say thank you to all for listening and for participating. Any comments?
No, thank you very much for organizing this.
Thank you, Mark, for your
Thank you
participation.
very much for having us.